On behalf of our center, welcome to Utah Valley University. I've got just a few announcements and acknowledgments that we've got to work through here quickly at the beginning. First, if you're here to receive CLE credit for attending the session, you just need to sign the CLE list at the registration table, which is in the foyer outside. Second, if you're a UVU student and you need to leave the session early to get to a class, please exit quietly, preferably when we transition from the presentation part to the Q&A session. I think the transition is right at the class break, or we've targeted, try to be right at that class break. Third, for the teachers here, if you've been to our events before, and I think most of you have been, you've heard us talk about or announce that we're developing a master's degree program with you in mind. Well, I'm thrilled to announce that our program has been fully approved, and later this fall we'll be taking applications for our Master of Arts in Constitutional Government, Civics, and Law degree. The program will have a non-thesis track designed especially for teachers, as well as a thesis track for researchers. Classes will begin next summer. If you join the program, you spend your first 2 weeks here at UVU, and then you do 12 months of online learning, and you do your last 2 weeks at the University of Oxford. So, it should be pretty fun. Now, just two quick acknowledgments. First, we're going to hear today from current and past UVU students, and both of whom were Eric Zachary Wood research assistants for the Center for Constitutional Studies. This is an incredible program we have where UVU students can work in the center doing graduate level research on cutting edge projects. We wouldn't have this program if it weren't for Brian and Angela Wood, who I think are here. Thank you very much. We love the Wood assistants in the center. And then lastly, this conference has been made possible in part by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Democracy Demands Wisdom. The Center for Constitutional Studies and Utah Valley University thank the NEH for this opportunity. Now with that, I get to introduce our speakers. This is the 7th session of our conference. It's entitled The NEH Western State Constitution Project, Methodology and Findings. So we'll hear first from Dr. Nicholas Cole, he wins the award, I think, for traveling the farthest. He's actually flown over from the University of Oxford to make this presentation. He's a senior research fellow at Pembroke College at Oxford. He's also the founder and the creator of the Quill project, which you'll learn about in just a minute. Joining Dr. Cole is Nick Jensen. Nick just graduated in history and is the co-team lead of this research project that you'll be hearing about. And with also joining Nick is Cashlyn English, who just graduated in philosophy with a constitutional studies minor, in political science joint major, and she's also a nationally ranked rodeo competitor. So pretty impressive. She's the other co-lead with Nick on this project. So with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Dr. Cole.
Well, it's great to be back at UVU and speaking to you all. As Scott said, I run a project that is part of a long-term collaboration between Oxford and UVU and a few other universities. And the core of the project is really this question. You heard this morning from Judge Sutton about the importance of state constitutional law. The question is, how do those texts come into being? How do you end up with a constitutional text? Or for that matter, any kind of other law you might care to name? Now, there are basically only two ways you can have a text. You can ask a very clever person to write one for you and agree to do everything that person says. And ancient lawgivers were of that type. So Draco in Rome, Solon in Athens, and so on. But in the modern world, that hasn't normally seemed like a very good way of doing anything. So what America's founders did at both state and federal level is said, we will make use of a process of collective authorship. We will write these documents together. And to do that, they drew on a long history of parliamentary debate that had originated in Britain. By the late 19th century, when the constitutions that the project the students will talk about was written, this idea of collective action had become deeply embedded in American and British life. Lots of people were publishing rules, books of rules, for how to go about this. If you had been at school in the 19th century, you would have learned how to collectively author texts as part of your education. And this process we're familiar with perhaps from the 1787 Constitutional Convention, but these kinds of debate processes went on at state level as well. And in fact, not just for writing constitutions, but for many, many other areas of life. If you think about what you need for a successful process of collective authorship, there are a few things that process needs to provide. Why do you need rules at all? Well, first of all, there needs to be some clarity on what you have already agreed. Otherwise, there are going to be endless arguments about did we really agree that or didn't we? You need a process that is going to facilitate debates on points of disagreement. There needs to be a structure within which people can disagree with each other. You need a process that is going to provide clarity on what would be the effect of taking a vote, making a choice at any particular moment. And you need to provide some reassurance as well that there is going to be space for people to disagree. And there needs to be as well an opportunity for compromise. That's why these processes are very complicated. That's why they take a long time. That's why the federal constitution took 3 months to write. That's why state constitutional conventions have taken anything from a month through to a whole year to complete their work. And just to give you a sense of the kind of complexity we're talking about, to get the text of the US Constitution, which is shorter than some undergraduate essays that I read, took approximately 1,500 votes to be taken by the members of the Constitutional Convention. To write the state of Utah's constitution in 1895 took approximately 3,400 votes or points of decision to end up with that text. Or to put it another way, what did the committee structures look like? This is a diagram showing the committee structure for the Federal Convention. Now, the Federal Convention had to deal with a number of important issues, but probably fewer issues. If you were listening to the talk this morning, you'll understand why. Probably fewer issues than most state conventions. And so they had a committee structure which we can diagram out like this. When we took that same approach to trying to diagram out the state-level committee structures, you can see that the diagram just doesn't work nicely at all, and we're having to rethink how we present that. Because state-level conventions are dealing with a level of complexity, actually, much greater normally than the federal convention. And that's why, for the last 8 years or so, we've been using computers to try and understand these processes in more detail. Understanding how a negotiated text like a constitution has come into being is remarkably difficult, because the nature of the records that are kept is difficult. They are designed, the records that we have are normally designed to facilitate the process for the people in the room. They're not normally designed to help people later understand what had happened. And secondly, for the state-level constitutional documents, the scholarly attention has simply not been there. There simply hasn't been the focus on these state-level efforts. So in fact, a lot of the resources that you'll find online are deeply inadequate. And we're trying to change that through this project, and a lot of that has involved the hard work of students at UVU. Why bother? Why is it interesting to know why these texts came into being at all? Well, there are a number of reasons that you might want to think about. Lawyers might be interested in this process because it might help them understand what was intended by the meaning of text. But for the rest of us, we need to understand how our democratic institutions came into being, and that's probably especially important at a time when globally there is much less trust in democratic institutions than there has been for a long time. You heard this morning about the complexity of state constitutional law. Here are some more statistics. America used to write and rewrite its constitutions extremely frequently, and through different amendment processes, it still does. As part of this project, we had support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we focused on constitution writing in the American West, which the students will tell you more about in a moment. I want to pay tribute, though, to the people that made this project possible intellectually. One of those was Rodney Smith, who was the director of the center before Matthew, who really had a vision for applying for this grant, and who very sadly died during COVID and didn't live to see it. But also the students of that generation of the center worked very hard on some pilot projects that made this grant application successful. We've tried to map out these state constitutional conventions for you in lots of different ways that the students will talk through, and tried to show you a kind of track changes on steroids approach to these texts. We've tried to show you where particular language came from and who was responsible for it. I think with that kind of introduction to what we're trying to achieve, I'd like to hand over to the students to tell you a little bit more about how they went about their work. But I want to leave you with one thought before I do. The purpose of universities, aside from education, is to find out new things. That's what research really means. It is the most important thing that universities do. This project really is cutting-edge research, and students have been at the core of driving it forward. Cashlyn.
All right, hello and welcome. We're so excited to have you guys here and see all these young faces. I can remember being in government and history classes, and I had no idea state constitutions were a thing. So you're very blessed and lucky that you get to actually know you have one and how important they are. So what we're gonna kind of walk you through is what we did, how we achieved it, some of like the fun ins and outs of the different project, the different states, and some of the weird things that go into state constitutions that make them unique. So we operate under a Western States project from an NEH grant, as Scott and Dr. Quill kind of mentioned. It's from the National Endowment for the Humanities. What it is a digital model for the 5 Western states that we did. So Wyoming, Idaho, Washington, North Dakota, South Dakota, and then a joint commission that the Dakotas had when they separated as territories. This grant we've got after we finished the Utah model of their 1895 Constitution in January of 2020. The Center for Constitutional Studies then sought, with Pembroke's help, to apply for this digital advancement grant, and then once we received it, it has helped us be able to fund our engaged learning approach at the center and help us develop our infrastructure and other user interfaces. After year 2 on this project, we realized that we finished our first 3 significantly early and we needed a harder challenge. After that, we added the Dakotas and the Joint Commission, and that's what we just finished a day ago, literally. So the aim for this project was that the West would be an interesting selection to look at the ways ideas were transferred to and transformed by the American Western states. It exhibited a new American democracy in a sense. So this is just kind of a snapshot of what the states look like. It's important, and we're extremely proud of this grant. Only 15% of project applicants are funded, and we were very fortunate to be fully funded as a public institution. Was awesome. What does it look like? What is the process? What are we actually doing? So as students, We physically get to fly in an airplane, go to these different archives, have many bad singing hours in a car as we go to learn and find and go through these records. And we physically get to see the records. You're flipping through boxes and files and pages of handwritten documents from these archives. What we start and what we want to achieve is they're derived from journals, debates, proceedings, newspapers especially, and that we go to the archives and find. We get to contact, travel, work with them. We took scans, pictures, and copies of these numerous boxes. We encountered our fair share of paper cuts and some very friendly archivists along the way that made this possible. From there, we transcribed the record and obtained a format that we can use to put into the Quill platform that Dr. Cole's created and he talked about. So from archive to a digitization that we can then produce the model. So we gained a healthy respect for second grade teachers for some very handy cut and paste jobs, as they literally will strike out the name Montana and pencil in Wyoming, and that is their enabling act, or that is their water rights bill. So it was an interesting job that's done by a lot of these. We observed that the state record individually that were published in some states had to be supplemented by newspapers. Some didn't have committee records, some only had a journal, some only had debates. We had recognized that there's a potential bias in newspapers versus the different editorial and publisher editions and notes, so we tried to provide many resources there where you'll have multiple accounts from different sources. So it's interesting to see how the overly detailed proceedings bring out the humanity in the conventions. You see instances for a demand for ice. They have random ice cream breaks, or a call, sorry, my friend can't make it today, he ate too many beans. Literally is what it will say. So it's fun to see the humanity in it. They argue that, you'll see later, Nick will make a joke about the demand to smoke and different things. So it's interesting to see that these are people that are producing very elaborate documents. So they break the often established rules and disalign certain individuals from participating in newly formed governments. We see different amazing suffrage debates, as well as important state and central topics. So why seek statehood? Why is this process important? Why are we focused on this? So this is from the federal constitution, Article 4, Section 3. The Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory and other property belonging to the United States. The federal government is who is responsible for appointing territorial leadership, and statehood allows for locals to select their own government. Some gubernatorial administrations leading up to statehood were local to the territory, but others lived outside the territory at the time, so we see a lot of overlap. For example, in Wyoming, Senator Stewart from Nevada sat on almost every single committee. So you see some overlap there. The political party of appointed territorial governors switched to match the party, often of that of the president. We see that happen a lot. So the polarity and the polar divide is interesting too. The business interest in particular, what they wanted to be out of touch for certain states, they brought to a light. So Wyoming cared a lot about water. Washington cared a lot about what their seacoast was doing. So just different specifics to it. In Wyoming in 1888, the territorial legislature passed a joint resolution requesting Wyoming for statehood, for example, and this is when the House then took the bill to DC, and that's how you call for statehood. So the Constitution gives the federal government the power over territories. This allows for local legislation. We see the swing in power between the parties and the influence of out-of-state governors, like in Wyoming and Nevada, and therefore this new local leadership allows for the economic growth that they want to become a state. So this legal process that is done, comes again from the federal Constitution. So new states may be admitted by the Congress into this union, but no new state shall be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of any other state, nor any state be formed by the junction of two or more states or parts of states, without the consent of the legislatures of the states concerned as well as of the Congress. That's all it says. So it's like free for all. Put your stakes in the corner and that's what you get. Literally is how it felt. So it was interesting because they didn't have a lot of guidance. So from there, they say very little about what is needed for admission, only that the territory you can't double dip and you can't take from your neighbor without consent. So the typical process for admitting states through this so-called Enabling Act is unique because all of these states were under the same Enabling Act in 1889. The territory will then call for a constitutional convention, produce a constitution, ratify it by popular vote, and deliver it to the federal government for final approval. In this way, enabling legislation serves as a blueprint for statehood. While both chambers of Congress express support for Wyoming and other states as well, no final action actually constitutes an enabling act until later. We see that the process informally starts with a petition to become a petition to the federal government for statehood. It officially starts when that enabling legislation is actually approved. You go to convention, you meet, you argue a lot, and then you actually ratify and you have congressional approval, and then you get to be a state. So, and then we get to live in them. I'll pass it off to Nick for this next part.
Thank you, Cashlyn. So every convention begins with the establishing of the rules. I guess I should click the slides over so you guys see what I'm talking about. Every convention begins with establishing the rules that they will attempt to follow. Typically, the temporary president would appoint a group of delegates at the beginning of the convention to draft these set of rules, which then would be given to the convention where they were read and revised further. These rules would often overlap, some conventions borrowing and copying rules from previous state conventions or the rules used by the federal legislation. They'd cover everything from the proper manner to make a motion, when the convention would convene, and what things can and cannot be debated on, and much, much more. The 1787 convention agreed on a list of 20 rules. The rules of state conventions were much lengthier, with 5 of these states having 40 to 60 rules apiece. These state constitutional convention rules included many provisions that were not addressed in 1787, such as the rate at which non-voting officers, clerks, and stenographers were to be paid, the duties of the sergeant-at-arms, and other such provisions. A famous rule of the 1787 convention was that all deliberations must be kept secret. In the instance of state conventions, however, no such rule existed, and instead rules were provided on how journalists might attend these proceedings without the impeding of the flow of the proceedings. Despite these differences, many of the rules of parliamentary procedure remained largely unchanged between the federal convention and the state conventions. As a platform, Quill is made to fit these rules of the convention, as Dr. Quill was talking about earlier. However, much to the dismay of the editors on Quill, the rules were not always followed. Those often happen in inconsequential moments within the record. It was our job to model these events despite the rules not being consistently followed. The purpose of these rules were to aid in the creation of the best possible constitution. A convention with no rules would not be successful, but similarly, a convention with too strict of rules would hinder the process. As I mentioned, the rules were not always followed, but they were not always enforced either. Rules could be enforced more strictly in some cases to hinder the speech of a delegate that they did not particularly want to hear from. For example, a call to order would halt any discussion going on in a moment and allow the president of the convention to determine whether or not the rules were being followed. Okay. A unique thing that we see in these conventions is how delegates would amend the rules when they regarded a rule as a nuisance. On this example comes from Idaho. Rule 11 stated that no member shall speak more than twice on the same question, unless by leave of the convention, and he shall confine himself to the questions under debate and avoid personality. On the 12th day of the convention, Mr. Batten moved to amend Rule 11 to add the following: and in no case shall he be allowed to occupy more than 15 minutes at any one time, except by unanimous consent of the convention. This was met with criticism, however, from one Mr. Reed, who stated, "As I understand it, the purpose is to cut off debate and not allow but 15 minutes. We have a standing rule that members shall not speak more than once or twice. Every gentleman who is attending this convention came here with the view to work expeditiously and faithfully, which we have done, and also to consider these matters properly. I'm sure, while I want to shorten the session as much as anybody, as I am anxious to go home as anybody, and made as many sacrifices perhaps as any other member of the convention in order to attend it and do my duty here, yet I think members ought to be allowed to discuss these matters thoroughly." Mr. Batten responded to Reed saying, "Why not require one and all to condense our arguments into short speeches, or to reduce what we have to say to something that is simply argumentative and not mere lot of gush and twaddle, and such as that? And it only is in the spirit I offer the rule. If there are any gentlemen here who desire to use this as a nursery for political bottle washers or desire to ventilate some high moral ideas, let him hire a hall and we shall all go listen to them. Mr. Beatty then later expressed his disapproval on the amendment, stating that the acceptance of this rule will affect even the chairman of the committees upon whose shoulders devolve often explanations of the measures which are introduced, and would cut off the chairman, thus framing the proper explanations. As I mentioned before, parliamentary procedure is particularly relied upon by those attempting to stop procedures from being made, and this story shows three of them. Mr. Beatty asked that this matter better to lay over for a few days, which was voted against by the delegates. Mr. Mayhew asked that the votes be counted individually. Mr. Morgan asked for the whole matter to be referred to the Committee on Rules for them to discuss it. It was also voted against these were also voted against by the delegates. Despite the attempts to hinder and delay the vote, not only was the time limit amendment adopted, but an amendment to the amendment was passed that reduced the time limit to 10 minutes. I'll share one more quick comical example of amending rules. A seemingly inconsequential rule became an issue for the delegates in Wyoming, who kept failing to acquire a quorum large enough to advance with proceedings. And so in order to remedy this, they amended the rules to remove rule number 4. After repealing Rule 4, there was no more issues getting a quorum. So how was it that one rule halted the entire convention from proceeding? Well, Rule 4 stated that no smoking was permitted in the hall while the convention was in session. In that small debate, where time was imposed upon debates, which wasn't a rule in the 1787 convention, we are invited to ask ourselves how the framers of these state constitutions felt like they were emulating the values and ideas of the framers of the 1787 Constitution of the United States. How was the 1787 Constitution used as a tool to convince others in debate and try to push their agenda? An issue heavily debated in Idaho's convention was a jury system. In their Declaration of Rights, it is written that the right of trial by jury shall remain inviolate. But in civil cases, 3/4 of a jury may render a verdict. This second clause concerning the 3/4 verdict is consistently referred to as an innovation by the delegates of Idaho, despite it first being implemented by Nevada Constitution 2 decades earlier. The word innovation carrying a negative connotation is interesting to note here. Several delegates were opposed to this clause, claiming that both civil and criminal cases should be settled by a unanimous verdict, as they had in the past. Those in favor of it contended that the unanimous verdict for civil seizures were obsolete and cited Nevada as an example of the 3/4 verdict working properly. This rapidly turned into a discussion about the constitutional interpretation of the right to a jury. Mr. Reed, who was not in favor of the 3/4 verdict, said, whenever the jury system sees an innovation, whenever it sees the rights of the people menaced, those who have studied the law and precedents and from experience found out what protects the rights of clients and people have always been first to battle back any innovation that has encroached upon the rights of the people. And as an evidence of this, I appealed to the convention that framed the Constitution of the United States and that framed Constitution of every state in this union. Where lawyers were in majority, they have adopted constitutions that have made this country and these states great and glorious. I appealed to this convention to be careful in adopting innovations. We have the great principles of government under which the eastern states have prospered and profited. Let us follow experience. Despite all this, all of the amendments to remove the 3/4 phrase did not pass the convention. And in fact, in later session, the delegates vote into the Constitution another innovation. The legislation may provide that in all cases of misdemeanors, 5/6 of a jury may render a verdict. It is remarkable to read delegate convictions with less than unanimous results for more than 80 years following this conference. This is an excellent example of how state constitutional conventions are not hesitant to experiment with new ideas, even when critics point to the convention that framed the Constitution of the United States as justification for their opposition. Later, it was determined among the delegates that if they were moving forward with the 3/4 and 5/6 verdicts, it was important to understand if people were thinking that juries had to have 12 people on it. Mr. Reed stated, "Today you cannot go into federal court and try a case with a jury of less than 12. Because the hand that traced the Constitution and the men who adopted it, that instrument which the people praise every 4th of July, says trial by jury shall remain inviolate." So you cannot try a case in the federal court with 12 unless you amend the Constitution of the United States. We can see the delegates who utilized the Constitution as a tool for debate used emotional language to try to connect to the delegates' respect to the framers of the Constitution, asking the convention to remember that the instrument which people praise on every 4th of July. It seemed there was a number of delegates who didn't actually realize that the United States Constitution does not have a specific requirement for how many jurors are needed to be on a jury, which was received with criticism. One delegate saying, "As I understand it, the common law of England has never been adopted by the Congress of the United States." Delegates had to interpret the Constitution to show why they felt the jury should have 12 members after discovering the Bill of Rights does not specify the number of jurors. In further debate on this issue, Mr. Poe made the following statement. "What is a trial by jury is the question under the Constitution of the United States and the precedents that we have. It is what this Constitution is to determine. I have great respect for the wisdom of our fathers, but I think it is consideration of this matter that we ought to give some consideration in relation to that matter, and should here consider what was intended by the framers of the Constitution and of the United States when they said that every person should be entitled to a trial by jury. Now, the only way that we can determine as to what the very spirit and letter was is to see what their practice had been under that law. We find now that under the practice every state, or nearly so, until within a few years, the rule has been that when a man divided a jury, it was considered right that he had a jury to a jury trial by 12 men. I say that was the spirit and intention of the framers of the Constitution of the United States when they said that every man whose life, liberty, and property was to be interfered or taken away from him. And with that, I'll turn it back to Cashlyn.
Thank you, Nick. We keep you on your toes, just swapping faces back and forth on you, so bear with us. So perhaps on the surface, less engaging, yet largely important to the topic of Western states is water rights. So this isn't a conversation that was had in the states of Pennsylvania and those back east because they didn't have such large Western arid climates to deal with. So the constitutional provisions on irrigation and water rights advance the national conversation in a way somewhat similar to that of other social topics like trial by jury. However, irrigation and water rights fall uniquely within the state's purview only and do not overlap with federal legislation to the same extent that a trial by jury or other contentious issues would. Water is the lifeblood of the arid Western agricultural states. Indeed, the convention delegates found water to be so important that they enshrined them in the Wyoming Constitution that will become Article 8, irrigation and water rights. The Wyoming Constitutional Convention itself was part of a larger opera of Western state constitutional conventions happening in Colorado, California, obviously the Dakotas, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Utah that we showed in our models. We can see it being discussed by historians of the time, too. Lewis Gold accurately stated in a quote, "Much of what went into Wyoming's constitution was borrowed from the documents adopted by other states. For the provisions on water rights in particular, much of the language was developed actually in Colorado and to some extent California previous of." So we see this connection, what we like to call sisters in statehood. So the recognition given to the states that they began their convention together and they ended them in the same year and they were ratified within the same 2 years, the action took a commencement that we tied them together because it was so heavy. A lot of historians know and record them as being, oh, those were the 4 or 5 that happened in the same year. So What's interesting is this is the language from the Enabling Act. So, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that the inhabitants of all that part of the area of the United States now constituting the territories of Dakota, Montana, and Washington, as at present described, may become the states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Washington, respectively, as hereafter provided. So we see that that's the actual conversation that went forward. I found this fun stamp in our research that was actually an anniversary stamp for the states, and you can see it highlights the couple there in the corner, and it's this the 50th anniversary in 1939 that went out as a postage. So we need to find this and keep it in the center because it's unique to understand the prestige of what these states did together. So including Wyoming and Idaho, they drafted their constitutions in the same year around the same time, but while the sisters in statehood were signed in the Union in 1889 by President Grover Cleveland, Idaho and Wyoming were not signed until a year later in 1890 by President Benjamin Harrison. Unique about Washington is that they wanted to be in the Union before 1889, but their bill kept getting defeated by the Senate. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer, a newspaper, on May 12, 1889, reported on the defeat and disappointment of the territory that felt that they were not a part of the Union. They believed, quote, that Washington will remain a territory until the Republican Party is in a possession of the national government. It will never be able to take the place to which it is entitled so long as the democracy is to prevent it, end quote. Another one that was argued on February 22nd, 1889, the Enabling Act was signed by Cleveland that year. Benjamin Harrison, the Republican president, beat out that Democratic president there soon after. So you see how the politics of what's happening on a federal level deeply affect what's going on in the states at this time. The 1888 Republican Party platform made the statement that the government by Congress of the territories is based upon necessity only to the end that they may become states in the Union. Therefore, whenever the conditions of population, material resources, public intelligence, and morality are as such to ensure a stable local government therein, the people of such territories should be permitted as a right to inherit in them for themselves the Constitution and their state government, and be admitted into the Union as such. South Dakota should be of right to be immediately admitted as a state in the Union under the Constitution, framed and adopted by her people, and we wholeheartedly endorse the action of the Republican Senate in twice passing bills for her admission. The pending bills in the Senate to enable the people of Washington, North Dakota, and Montana territories to form constitutions and establish state governments. These should be passed without unnecessary delay. The Republican Party pledges itself to do all that's within its purview and power to facilitate the admission of the territories of New Mexico, Wyoming, Idaho, Arizona to the enjoyment of the self-government as states of the Union, so much of them as are now qualified and as soon as possible within our action. So that is a verbatim quote from the Republican Party in 1888. So you see the sense of urgency for these states to be admitted into the Union, and it wasn't without obstacle, but they understood the importance of it. We see the connectivity between the states. These are some fun quotes. I apologize for what's happening with the slides, but the connection between the two in the conventions, as there's similar messages that were modeled and exchanged between. So there were wishes of good luck and greetings amongst the conventions, of goodwill for the completion that was coming, and a voice of fellow encouragement as they sought to complete this endeavor. There's a fun one. There's a fun one that talks about that there's actually some stars that are emblazoned on their national flag and that they will honor them as they share them between the states, and that's from Washington. And then just a simple greetings, fellow neighbor, brother upstairs, to North Dakota and South Dakota between them as well. So we see the interconnectedness of these records as well, and it's important to talk about the challenges that were in the records for us. We sit there and we read and we go through hundreds of thousands of pages of these old men talking, essentially, is the argument, and it's amazing, it's fascinating, and you can see and you can hear the voice and the tone that comes through with the different secretaries, because that's who produced the transcriptions that we have from the journal and debates. And we found that in South Dakota, it was very thorough, very consistent, very few typos. We hardly ever had to use the SIC tool to explain why there was a typo in it, versus in North Dakota, which also kept the record for the Joint Commission, there were numerous typos. It was extremely inconsistent. We had a hard time following the chronological, keeping track between the journal and debates and a chronological order of what was occurring. So the variation in the secretary was a big challenge as we sought to keep the model as accurate as possible. And this was when we leaned heavily on newspapers in order to be able to achieve what really happened in that day, to give it what was coming across the secretary's desk in the most correct and accurate order. And in doing so, we had multiple sources to get the fullest interpretation. The Joint Commission is very fascinating. If you were in the morning session, Nick talked about it, and he'll talk about it again as well at the end here. But just what it was comprised of was 7 delegates from each state, North and South Dakota, and they were appointed they met on July 16th, so a little bit after the start, in Bismarck, and they had 12 standing committees, and what these committees consisted of, just to name a few, so it was records, it was the public library, it was miscellaneous property, it was militia, federal appropriations. It's like divorce court, who gets the house and who gets the kids, right? So it was an understanding of where the territory debts were going, where the assets were going to occur, and different things. It was interesting. Unlike the South Dakota Convention, this Joint Commission did not begin in a process that had a preformed or coherent constitution. South Dakota actually had a failed Sioux Falls Convention that we use in the model, because it's basically kind of a cut and paste job that they end up ratifying in their second one. Nor did it follow the open approach, which was North Dakota, because they started completely from scratch. They had nothing. They just used standing committees to draft reports, and then those reports were adopted or rejected or amended or substituted through various debate. So in concurred in articles, this joint resolution comes to be and then approved by each convention from these standing committees themselves. So after meeting for the various days they submitted and was included in both state constitutions. So Dakotas are unique in that way. The variation in the dates of these, so all of them but Wyoming started on July 4th, which was interesting. And the end dates varied a little bit too. So Idaho finished August 6th, South Dakota finished August 5th, North Dakota was a little longer, finishing August 17th, Washington a little longer than him, finishing August 22nd, and then Wyoming was slightly after. They were September 2nd to September 30th, but all of them occurred in that summer-fall period of 1889. We saw various challenges that resulted in different end dates. In Washington, some delegates had to return home because there were some substantial fires that were happening, and then there were lengthy debates in the Joint Commission that caused South Dakota and North to end at different dates as well. So we see these all incorporated in the model, and Nick will talk about how we see them in debate. So what's important to know is this is just some snapshots of what it looks like in Quill, how we develop committees. So you have the convention, committee of the whole. Those are your two main bodies. So I'm not going to explain how a whole committee works for you. You guys can read Robert's Rules of Order for extra credit, I'm sure. But how many people that were actually present versus how many documents were actually created. So if you follow the red circles here, you can see Wyoming had 50 delegates present with 175 document amendments, whereas Idaho had 73 members present and 629 document amendments. This contributed to the size of the model and the record, as well as a 600 page count difference. So the larger in attendance and quorum, obviously the more debate was had. So just interesting too that while they were accomplishing the same end goal of being a state, the approach taken by each was slightly different. Back to you, Nick.
As Cashlyn mentioned, larger debates meant larger, more detailed records and more possible committees. Often we had a record of the conventional proceedings, but lacked the proceedings of the committees. However, the record we do have, we are able to infer what the convention saw as important issues just from the names of the standing committees alone. On average, in these 5 states, they averaged about 35 committees. South Dakota had the most with 41 in total, with Wyoming having the least with only 29. In contrast, the United States Constitutional Convention, which is pictured here, only had 14. Unlike the United States Constitutional Convention, the new and incoming states of the 1880s, if not all the states throughout the years, had considerably large conventions and ended with longer, more detailed documents. So yeah, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of how these committees are created, the purposes why they were created, and the goals that they were setting out to do. Generally, these committees were proposed in the rules of the convention and agreed upon by the members. Soon after the president of the convention being sworn in, the members of the committees would be appointed. These committees ranged in topic and purpose from education, legislative, executive, just name a few, to special committees, which were often hyper-specific in their goal and purposes. Yeah. So some examples from Idaho and Wyoming here. The first example we see is a special committee in Idaho. Mr. Morgan moved a committee of 3 be appointed to escort the recently elected permanent president to what we can only assume is the front of the convention hall. The second example is of one of the standing committees in Wyoming. However, in other states, similar documents were moved, with these committees and conventions. Each convention chose committees based on member proposals from citizen interest and concern. Citizen interest and concern was further influenced by geographical culture and culture of the time period. As these new territories are organizing their own states, they were presented with immediate problems that influenced their debate. In February of 1889, an Idaho newspaper called by the name of the Mountain Home Bulletin reported that an omnibus bill was proposed in the House as a substitute to the enactments that would take the northern Idaho County and cut it up into other counties. This was an area of concern for Idaho as they prepared for their constitutional convention to begin in that July. In this article, the author says the Haley, Idaho politicians have worked like beavers to get the Committee on Counties and County Boundaries to report the omnibus bill. Later in the same article, he recounts the actions of the Ada County politician who is against the omnibus bill and has his own ideas on how parts of Alturas County could be split, mainly taking a chunk and annexing it to Ada County. Later in this convention, the members proposed the Committee on Names, Boundary, and Organization of Counties. We've touched on some differences between these committees, but there are also similarities based on their geographical culture. Many topics including water rights, agriculture, federalism, education, and military. We will take a look at these. Some of the more general committees that we found were Committee on Rules, Committee on Preamble Bill of Rights, Executive Department, and as you can see, they line up with the constitution of their constitutions, each committee taking a different article. The more specific to the state ones we found were like mining and mines, public buildings and grounds, education and school lands, as I mentioned, water rights, tidelands, navigable streams, stuff like that. Here are some unique committees to the states. In Idaho, we have the Committee on Livestock, Committee on Names and Boundaries, as I mentioned. Washington, harbors, tidewaters, navigable streams, homestead and property exemptions. Railroads and telegraphs was a major committee in Wyoming, but was absent in the other states. South Dakota had a committee on rights of married women, which was referred to the article on prohibition because it was considered a women's issue that their husbands were drunk. That was later corrected in the convention. The sort of, as Cashlyn mentioned, the special committee of committees was the Joint Commission between the Dakotas. In this special committee, the public records of the territory, we have subcommittees like the public records of territory and the disposition of the records of the territory, which broadly overlapped in their subject, but were appointed for different matters. The uniqueness of the Joint Commission is in the specificity of its subcommittees. Are we? Technical difficulties, we're good. Okay, sorry. Committees were not predetermined, but were created in the Joint Commission. They were created as almost a motion by motion, just as they came up. They would motion to make a committee on 2, a committee on 3, a committee on 5, whatever, as the need arose. And with that, I will turn it over to Cashlyn.
All right, guys, we're almost done. Thank you. So looking forward, what we sought to accomplish and what was actually done. So the NEH grant that we were awarded, we were supposed to complete 3 states. We ended up doing 5 in the Joint Commission, and we are very proud of it. The similarities and differences between the states provided the necessary experience for us to endeavor with future projects. So our center is very excited to work on our 50 in 10 approach, where we are going to model all 50 current state constitutions in 10 years, and these few and some others that we've been working on are already adding to that goal. So it's important to note that this is an interpretive project. Over 12,000 files went into the production of these models that we got to work with, and it's incredible to know and understand. That being said, between the newspapers and the files, we seek to give you the most accurate, updated official model of what happened during those conventions in those days as we can. The application of the project, as Dr. Cole mentioned in the beginning, is for legal research, for lawyers and judges to use, for historians and graduate research, for me to get to go on to use, and then education for primary K through 12, for you guys to know and understand and recognize the importance of state constitutions. And this is something we're very passionate about, and we want the conversation to continue, how important state constitutions are, and that you guys get to be educated in it better than I was when I was in high school. So Quill won't always give you the answer. It's up to you to be the researcher, but please go look at the platform, enjoy the project, and thank you guys for being here.
Thank you, Cashlyn and Nick and Dr. Cole. So we've come to the end of our second session. Thank you all for being with us this morning. A few notes, just logistical notes for you. Well, actually, first, I just want to point out to our high school guests, the students you saw presented, they're like 4 years away from where at least the seniors among you are right now. They probably knew about as much about this as you do now 4 years ago. I hope you this is just an example of what awaits you as you pursue higher education. And certainly any of you who are interested in doing this sort of work, we'd love to see you in the Center for Constitutional Studies. But whatever your field is, you're so close to doing incredible things. So just keep pushing forward. As you make your college choice, we hope you'd consider UVU. As you see on all the billboards, there's a place for you here. With that, lunch. As we end the session, we need to excuse this section right here. If all the other sections should hang out for just a minute, we'll let this section get out. They've got a bit of a hike over to where they're getting lunch. The rest of you, your teachers know the drill. Well, I'm just going to read this or else I'm going to get myself in trouble. So let's see. This time, you and a couple of your students can exit the ballroom to the commons area to pick up the pizza. There's both cheese and pepperoni, water bottles, and napkins. The pizza will have a teacher's name and school written on them. And there will be one of a UVU student from the center will be there to help hand them out. We've provided enough pizza for each person to have 2 slices. Once you have your pizzas, you can either take them to our food court or to the outside area or head to your bus. The courtyard with the waterfall right over here is a great place to eat. The one thing we need to make sure is, hang on for just a second, there's a Starbucks. I'm afraid we can't have you all stop and get drinks at Starbucks on the way out. It will just completely overwhelm the place, so just pass on Starbucks as you're going out to lunch. We do have drinks for you out there. Okay, looks like our group is cleared, so again, teachers, you're going to send someone out to the tables to get your pizza and then move as a group to where you're going to eat. Last thing, you catch your bus where it dropped you off.